Welcome everyone to our April Lunchtime lecture. Before we get started, I wanted to make sure you all know about our upcoming Texas Fight Tour. All are welcome to come out to one of the stops in a Texas city near you and hear directly from our Texas Longhorns head football coach, Steve Sarkisian, head men's basketball coach, Chris Beard, head women's basketball coach, Vic Schaefer, and athletic director, Chris O'Connie, about the future of our Texas Longhorns athletics programs. There'll be great food and drinks, plus autographs and photo opportunities, and it'll be a good time for the whole family. We'll kick it off in Austin, then head to San Antonio, Dallas, Houston, and Fort Worth. We're going to have a lot of fun, and you can get your tickets now at texasexes.org/tour. But now for today's lecture. Our special guest today is Stephen Pedigo, professor of practice at UT's LBJ School of Public Affairs. Today, he will explore the question, is Texas the future of America? Pedigo is an expert in economic and urban development, anchor engagement, city strategy, and placemaking. He has advised and collaborated with more than 50 cities, universities, developers, nonprofits, and Fortune 500 companies across the globe to build more creative, innovative, and inclusive communities. He is the founding executive director of the LBJ Urban Lab and a distinguished fellow in the NYU Schack Institute of Real Estate. Please welcome everybody, our Professor Stephen Pedigo.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you all. I'm excited to talk a little bit about my work with you all this afternoon, kind of explore this question, is Texas the future of America? So about a few weeks ago, I guess it's been more than a few weeks ago, I guess in the fall, I was asked to write an essay in the New York Times sort of exploring this question, looking at a lot of different things that were happening across the country, looking at primarily the recent census release and what that looked like in reflection of the US. And then what was really interesting about that data is that when you sort of start to unpack it a bit, you get a really interesting sort of look at how the country is changing over time. And when you look at that and sort of mirror that to what's happening here in the state of Texas, we get this interesting trend about a state that's becoming more urban, more metropolitan, more diverse, and really representing some of the changes that we're seeing across the country. So, in the next 25 to 30 minutes, I'm going to spend some time exploring this question with you, sharing some thoughts, some data, getting to the question of maybe what are some of the divides that we're kind of seeing in our state, even as our state grows and changes. What are some of the challenges that we face? And then possibly at the end raise an opportunity to think about some policy questions. I am a policy professor at the LBJ school, so obviously I do want to spend some time talking about some possible strategy ideas that could help us continue to maintain the state's competitiveness and prosperity. I want to encourage you to send in your questions and your comments and your thoughts. I'm going to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes. But then open it up for lots of Q&A at the end. So this is the time to send thoughts, questions, keep those going in the Q&A session. And maybe if you're sitting at a laptop, like maybe even just opening up the window and Googling my little essay there and taking a look at it at a glance a little bit as well. So, I think one of the ways to think about this as a Texan, as was mentioned in my bio, I'm at the LBJ school, but I am a Texan. I grew up in Beaumont, Texas, went to the University of Texas as an undergraduate, actually. Graduated in 2001 with my undergraduate, and then went on to graduate school. Have recently, after sort of 20 to 25 years of being away, of being other institutions, primarily a stop at NYU before coming up to back to the LBJ school. I had sort of an interesting perspective of looking about our state and looking from the outside in and sort of thinking about some of the trends that we were seeing. But what's interesting to me, and really kind of led sort of the frame for the work that I did with the New York Times article, was that a lot of times when people are looking for the trajectory of understanding how America is changing, we tend to a lot of times look out west. We look towards California. And there's actually an old saying that says that America is California, fast forward in a sense. And so I decided to as I started thinking about the Times piece, to go back and look at the data over time and look to see what was happening in California and compare that to the United States and Texas as well. And what's really interesting to me is that, California had this really significant boom of population between 1980 and 1990. But since then, it's really been Texas that has really seen the sort of boom in population. And you see that in the chart on the graph here from 1990 all the way to 2020. And what's interesting to me, actually, in the last decennial census, is that if we look at the U.S. population growth, which was about 7%, actually what's interesting is Texas is almost 2 times that growth in population, but California was actually now trailing the U.S. in population growth. And you can actually start to see this in some of the slides that we'll talk about in a second when we look at the growth of Californian cities and how those compare to Texas cities over time. So it really is kind of this interesting flip that we've seen where a lot of folks potentially maybe looked at trends in California. Now possibly is the new lens for which we want to understand, urbanization, the issues of diversification in terms of industry and population and what the face of America looks like. It's Texas maybe a more interesting place to do that. Just want to share some facts with you to kind of set the frame here. I think one of the things that's interesting to me, being a city guy, and a guy that studies cities and thinks about cities, and it's kind of this, and it's kind of my passion, is that when I came back to Texas, a lot of folks will say, well, why are you coming back to Texas to study cities? The face of urbanism isn't in Texas. In fact, urbanism is typically concentrated. The study of urbanism is in places like New York or out on the West Coast or in Chicago or Boston and other places. But what's interesting to me, and the reason I came back, is that if you look across our state, you see a state that represents 26 different metropolitan areas, 26 different types of cities. We've got border cities. We've got cities that are sort of in large metropolitan areas. We've got cities that are technology hubs like Austin. We've got global gateways in Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston. And so we get a real sort of question around this urban lab. And one of the things that was interesting is that in the recent census data is that the data sort of plays that out. In fact, you see a fast-growing Texas that is almost 2 times the U.S. average. The stat that I think is staggering for a lot of folks, particularly, is that over the last 10 years, if you look at the state of Texas, every day for the last decade, our state has added about 1,100 new residents, and a lot of those residents are living in metropolitan areas. And so, there's there's sort of this myth about Texas that we're this frontier type of state, but in fact, we are now one of the most urban metropolitan states in the country. In fact, 9 in 10 Texans live in metro areas. If you look at all of the population growth, 96, almost 100% of that actually occurred in our metros, in our cities, in our suburban counties, and not actually in rural counties. In fact, rural Texas grew less than 1%. In addition to that, I think what's really interesting as well is that a lot of that population growth, and you've probably seen if you follow demographics and policy here in the state of Texas, much of that growth has been people of color. In fact, we know that for every white resident, non-white Hispanic resident, we added 3 Black Texans, we added 11 Hispanic Texans, we added 3 Asian Texans. And so we're becoming much more diverse as a state as well. And you can sort of see these demographics really reflecting where the country is going as well. I think, again, speaking on that sort of point about Texas being this interesting lab, this face of where we want to understand the future of urbanism, this is data from the recent community survey that was recently released. And what struck me is there was a great ranking that looked at the large American cities across the country, looking at just city cores. And what's interesting is that of the top 4 cities that are growing, you see that Dallas and Houston and Austin are all among the top 4, whereas what we're seeing is places like New York City and Los Angeles and San Francisco. You see 3 Californian cities among the top 5 that are losing. And so again, Texas cities are growing, kind of considering and building on this idea of the rise of the rest, whereas perhaps we look at some of the larger cities in California and on the eastern coast starting to lose population as well. I think to understand the future of Texas, you have to really understand sort of what powers that. And for many of you that are in either Dallas, Fort Worth, out in San Antonio or Austin or Houston, we comprise what is considered to be actually one of the more powerful sort of growing, what we would call mega regions across the country. And we call that the Texas Triangle. And in fact, what you see is that if you look at that region, that sort of urban growth area in the middle of the state, about 35 million Texans will live there by 2050. It's about 1.2 billion in GDP. It's the world's 15th largest economy. In fact, if we looked at the Texas Triangle and we ranked it among countries, it would rank roughly the same size of Spain and Mexico. And it is become sort of this platform, which is this world-class knowledge-driven economy where we see lots and lots of venture capital, 99% of all the venture capital. And you see that with the names of the different types of companies that are relocating to our state. You know, Hewlett-Packard Enterprises. We've got Tesla, we've got Google, we've got extensions of Facebook and Apple and Oracle and others, all locating in the Texas Triangle because they want access to this knowledge-driven economy. You know, so as the state's growing, I think it's important to understand that there's a lot of things to celebrate across our state. We've had a strong economic development engine. We are becoming more knowledge-driven. But is this sort of, you know, like the country, if we are thinking about Texas being sort of this future lens by which to look at the other places, are we seeing an unequal boom, and what does that mean? The reality is yes, we're a divided state, and you know, 27% of Texans only 27% of Texans have a college degree. There's a good portion, nearly 1 in 5 Texans over the age of 25 don't have a high school diploma. We've got a lot of Texans that have no health insurance. We've got annual wages in our rural communities that are almost 25 to 30% lower than our metro areas. 15% of Texans live under the poverty line. And if we look at the issues of COVID, we know that particularly COVID has hit our Black and brown communities in Texas harder than other places. And why is that? We know that a lot of times inequality can be a large predictor of some of the challenges that we faced recently with the last pandemic. So we are, while seeing outstanding growth, becoming more urban, becoming more metropolitan, representing all those things that urban geeks like me get really excited about, we do see this sort of under this challenge of an economy that's really, in a sense, divided and creating some externalities for us to face. The thing I think that is exciting about this and being in Texas now and thinking about our opportunity to look to the future is that we do have an opportunity, I think, to not only just be the face of what America looks like, but also maybe to even set some opportunities for how to do that. And so we have an opportunity to build what I hope is a better Texas. You know, if you look in the past, 2 to 3 years, it's been a tough time for the country, but it's also been a very tough time for our state as well. We've faced challenges of the pandemic, and we're still sort of challenged with the externalities of how that is playing out. We've seen the economic and fiscal fallout that has come along with that. Many of our, while Texas is growing, a lot of many of our communities, particularly a lot of our rural communities and communities in the valley of Texas, still are facing economic challenges because much of the economy there is driven by service-based work and needing to think about how we improve wages and outcomes there. And then there's been this call for great call for racial equity in our community. Looking at an opportunity about how we manage the pandemic going forward, thinking about the economic fallout and what that means and how we need to think about building better communities. And then through this lens of saying there's this opportunity to really have to create a more just community and just Texas gives us an opportunity to really start to address some of the challenges that we as a state face while we are growing super, super fast and having to face a lot of externality challenges such as affordability and thinking about how we deal with our traffic and our congestion and building an economy that's going to be very much more robust going forward. I think it's worthwhile before we sort of move into the policy side to also just talk about some of the larger trends by which we can look towards that have come out of this idea of the pandemic. And if many of you are like me, and you're lucky to have some hybrid flexibility in your work, many of you maybe are able to work remotely. This is in a way created an opportunity for the state in terms of an accelerated talent economy. We see this playing out across the country. And perhaps it's the reason that we see such a large boom in our state in terms of Californians moving to the Texas Triangle, or New Yorkers, or folks from Colorado or other places starting to look to our state as a place to live and raise their families and think about the opportunities with that. Because much of that has been accelerated by the pandemic. And so, if you think about urban growth and economic development over the last sort of several decades, much of that was driven about the idea of enterprise creation and attraction and retention. But what's interesting to me, as someone sort of that understands and thinks about economic development, is that in fact the pandemic has sort of accelerated this shift where you as an individual, you as an agent, get to make location decisions. And so we see this really shift to focus about communities having to think about how do they create quality of place? How do they ensure that they're creating equitable places where talent's going to be attracted to? And so we see this rise to a talent-based economy. We see capital following that. We see the places that will in the future be able to attract and retain talent is super great opportunity to build out real, strong, robust economies going forward. And Texas has an opportunity to really leverage some of the assets that come with this talent-based economy, particularly as remote work, as a privilege that a lot of us get to have, has created a lot of flexibility by the way we think about location decisions as individuals. I do wonder, and this will be the only piece of politics that I'll talk about today. And if you want to understand some thoughts on politics, I'd encourage you to take a look at my New York Times piece. I say all of that saying that there are things as a Texan and as someone that advises cities all over the country that really worry me about the trajectory of our state. And a lot of that is some of the things that we have seen socially happening across our state with things like the abortion bill, things like the challenge for transgendered students and others in our state. And I just wonder, are we potentially creating a climate in our state that is not going to be as conducive to all the things that we as a state has done so efficiently in the past? We've been a place where Texas has been laissez-faire, limited government, come grow your enterprise, help come sort of grow your family in a state, a place where we have been sort of welcoming of a lot of different types of people. And I wonder, does that create some challenges going forward? And this is a recent poll from the Texas Tribune and the University of Texas Polling Project, which is a terrific project that collaboration between those two enterprises. Looking at the direction of Texas and asking some of those questions. And it is of recent that a lot of Texans have particularly thought perhaps that because of some of these decisions, maybe, or other issues with the electrical grid or whatever, that perhaps we're on the wrong track with some of these top-down, very heavy-oriented sort of state policies. And so I just put this out there for us to spend a little time. Maybe we can engage with this in the Q&A, but I think this is important that as we think about a talent-based economy, really considering this point going forward. So my question for us is that if we are this future of America, if we are the face of what the U.S. will look like in terms of going forward, and we want to maintain our competitiveness, our prosperity, but do it in a way that's going to be more resilient and equitable. What are some policy recommendations and maybe a suite of ideas that we could lean on to ensure that we are continuing to sort of be that future, to be a place where folks will be attracted to grow businesses, where we can help businesses grow and scale, small businesses, and be a place where all different types of talent can create and sort of live a very sort of inclusive and prosperable quality of life. And so how do we plan for a more resilient Texas going forward? A big question, I think. So as part of that, over the course of the last, since I've been back at the LBJ School, colleagues at the Bush Institute, colleagues at the Kinder Institute, at Rice University, at the Hobby School at the University of Houston, and an array of also just private sector leaders and public sector leaders and other sort of thinkers across campus have come together with us to create some policy recommendations around that. And out of that, you see the covers there, our Metropolitan Blueprint Project and our Playbook for Resiliency Project, two publications that were kind of born out of the LBJ School and the Urban Lab work. And I encourage you just to do a quick Google and take a look at those, or we can send over the link when you're able to take a look at this video again. But as part of that, we've tried to lay out a series of policy ideas that really allow us to think about how do we keep Texas moving in the right direction? How do we continue our prosperity? How do we attract a new generation of Texans and retain a lot of native Texans, creating opportunity for people who were born and raised in Texas to also have a great quality of place as well. So, I think as we think about a policy framework going forward, there are really, for me, kind of three ideas to think through and three frameworks by this. The first, I think, is that it's important to understand that, Texas urbanism, in my mind, as someone that that is kind of a born again Texan and grew up in Texas, been back here, done a lot of work in our state, and now called this place home. We are a very unique place. We're a place that really thinks about the role of the market, the role of the private sector, how we build our communities. And so one of the great quotes from one of our series of focus groups was that as we think about the future of Texas urbanism has to be developed by Texans. It has to have a flavor. It can't be just exported from California or New York or Boston or Massachusetts. It has to have a real flavor to it. And so it has to be thought about through Texas in a format that really kind of relates to who we are. And so keeping that in mind, I think there's sort of three guiding principles. The first, I think, is that as a state, I would submit to you that we have to do a better job of investing in Texans. We do a lot of attraction of investment outside of attracting companies from California or residents from California to here or New York or other places. And believe me, all great signs of economic development. I know that Governor Abbott and a lot of folks would like to say, if you look at Texas, we're the #1 place for on Site Selection magazine for where people are investing their businesses. And all of that's terrific, but we are a state that doesn't do enough, I think, to invest in local Texans, in Texans that are here. And so there's a need to think about how we invest in current communities that are here, how we do that from skill development to small business to thinking about the quality of place development that happens. Secondly, I think the thing that is really unique to Texas, and I wrote about this before in Texas Monthly, is that what's interesting to me as someone who spends some time looking at the way that communities develop across the country and frankly across the world, our state is an interesting place because it has been a state that has really empowered local communities. And so what I mean by that is that as we look at the growth that happens in Beaumont, Texas, or Houston, or Austin, or Dallas, or even out in El Paso, the uniqueness of those growth models in those communities are very much tailored to those communities. It isn't a top-down size, a one-size-fits-all model. And with a state of about 40 million people and a state that has 26 cities across the country, across the state, you can't imagine that you'd have one growth model. And one of the things that worries me as we look to the future about how we maintain this competitiveness is that, in fact, maybe we've been moving to a direction where we're doing too much top-down legislation, too much from the state capital to the state legislature down, and not enough empowerment of local. That small c conservative governance has been such an important way forward for how Texas has grown in the past. Thirdly, as I mentioned before, the solutions have to be Texan. They have to be market-based. They have to engage the private sector, the nonprofit sector, our foundation communities, our higher education institutions to really to build upon the individual assets that our state has. So really quickly, because I do want to leave some time for questions, want to share with you sort of maybe 10 ideas by which I would think are really critical to the future of how we maintain competitiveness and how we really sort of center in on this idea of being that future of America. The first thing is that we have as a state, have a storied history of being real inclusive in partnerships and building partnerships rather than rivalries. And I say that have a history because as of recent, we've kind of moved away from that. You see the legislature seeing some infighting, you see cities fighting with the legislature, you see our governor and our lieutenant governor challenging cities, cities challenging counties, and not being all on the same page about what it means to make our state and push our state forward. And so one of the things that I think is super essential is that we got to get back to this idea of a state that really supports partnerships, that encourages collaboration between cities and suburban and rural communities, and really explores how we leverage partnerships among our sectors to ensure that we're building competitiveness going forward. So for me, that is super important, building on partnerships instead of these rivalries and trying to move policy outside of the realm of overly partisan politics, particularly as it relates to the growth of our communities and the competitiveness of our communities going forward. Secondly, I think we have to think more about how we foster resilience, how we think about inclusion. We've got to do more to help small businesses in the state of Texas. I think, as I said before, we got to move beyond just attraction, spurring and really ensuring that we're making investments in underserved Texas businesses, particularly as we want to think about building a more inclusive Texas. And then, you know, the key thing, I think, one of the assets that we as Texas are extremely lucky to have is this binational border. And we have to do a better job of thinking about the border as an economic development engine. And you've seen this in the news recently with this week with the recent border checks that are happening as it relates to security and immigration, and slowing trade and the flow across the border significantly. And if you talk to leaders in El Paso and Laredo and Brownsville and other communities across the border, what they'll tell you is that, in fact, we as a state miss a great opportunity to think about how we view the border as an economic development engine and not as sort of this divisive issue of immigration and security. So this real focus on how we think about our border as a way to really drive growth going forward. In my mind, that's going to be so super important to helping our communities in the Valley move beyond just being traditional service-based communities to being able to create export-driven economies that are family-supporting wages that can ensure the prosperity going forward as well. So future resiliency is so super important. Thirdly, as a faculty member at UT and someone that believes in the role of education, we got to do more to invest in Texans, the skills of Texans. And we've got a lot of great work that happens in our workforce development boards across the state of Texas, a lot of real outstanding work, frankly, but there's more to do there. We've got to align our growth opportunities. We've got to use technology. And I think one of the things that we all know in the face of the challenges with the pandemic, particularly as it relates to remote work, we got to do a better job of ensuring wraparound services around those skill training programs. We've got to make sure that childcare is in place. We got to make sure that we're doing mentoring and coaching and bringing sort of a fresh approach to some of our training opportunities as we think about the skills of Texans going forward. Fourth, we got to do a better job of addressing equity challenges, the inequities of issues as it relates to the challenges in our communities. Safety service nets for the folks that are working in our service-based economy, particularly those that are in this, that are delivering our food, that are taking care of our children, that are doing things that are related to ensuring that frankly, that our communities and our cities are able to function. We got to give safety nets to them. We got to ensure that we're building an infrastructure around childcare, pursuing better jobs, In fact, there's been a great analysis through some of my colleagues at UT, Professor Jensen and others, who have looked at the job creation in the state of Texas. And what's interesting, is fascinating, is that while we are creating a share of knowledge-based jobs, family supporting jobs, a lot of jobs that we are creating in the state of Texas are not family supporting jobs. They are jobs that are barely minimum wage types of jobs. And so we as a state have to raise a question about how do we want to improve the quality of life for our fellow residents. And much of that is through the idea of ensuring that we're creating not just jobs, but better jobs. And some of that helps us address some of the inequities that our state faces as well. Final, number 5, we got to do better job of healthcare, continue to think about healthcare as an economic development opportunity. Texas continues to see rural hospital after rural hospital after rural hospital close and close and close. That continues to happen here. We know the importance of healthcare as it relates to the pandemic. If we've never understood how important healthcare is to the economic prosperity of our communities, the pandemic has taught us that real, true lesson. And so we've got to do more around ensuring that we're building out healthcare that is reflective of the future of who our communities will be. And so that means modernizing healthcare assets, thinking about non-traditional solutions, building out a pipeline that can ensure that we've got the right type of training programs. And then while here in the state of Texas, it is somewhat controversial, but not in other places like Oklahoma and other places that are have very similar structures. We have to think about Medicaid expansion because we need those dollars to help modernize the healthcare system and ensure that our underserved communities, both in metro and in rural Texas, have the opportunity to create those assets that are needed to deliver healthcare that is reflective of the type of quality of place that we want to have in the state of Texas. We've got to lead the energy future. I saw today that Professor Weber and others at the Cockrell Engineering School and the Energy Institute released a great piece looking at the idea of moving Texas to net carbon zero and what that looks like and how we have to think about the future of energy. I've written a lot about this as well to say that if the energy revolution and the transition is going to happen, it's going to happen here in the state of Texas. And I say that, but we also don't want to be a state that gets left behind in that, understanding how important energy is to the communities in the Permian Basin, to the communities of Houston and otherwise. So we have to think about the future of energy. We already as a state are doing this. We're already the largest producer of wind power in the entire country, 5th producer of wind in the world, but have to do more about getting our state policies aligned with the idea of how we leverage energy creation for the creation of the next generation of jobs that are going to be really important to supporting the growth of Texas going forward. We got to think about our small communities and rural communities. We can't leave them behind. The challenge with rural communities is that you've got many of our communities across the state of Texas, because we're so wide, 847 miles from one tip to the other tip. That requires us to think about how we get metros and our cities and our communities and our suburban communities to plan together. We have to do that for our smaller communities as well. We've got to encourage young Texans that are leaving institutions like UT, like Texas A&M, like Texas Tech and others, and some of our private institutions to maybe think about returning back to home. But to do that, they've got to have viable economies. They've got to have the infrastructure to do that. So there is a need to not just think about how rural communities can support the politics of one party versus another, but really making a commitment to ensuring that we're investing in the prosperity of those communities going forward. And that's going to require us to think about a new approach to how we do rural development in the state of Texas. We have to engage our universities and our community colleges, building on our community colleges as places of community hubs, leveraging the power that they have to support entrepreneurship, thinking about how universities not just become an institution that sits on the outside, but becomes a real player about how we solve urban and rural and metropolitan challenges. I know President Hartzell at the University of Texas here at UT and with the reevaluation and the strategic plan here at UT are really raising questions about how UT Austin can be a better anchor. And just like UT is starting to do this, we got to get more of our institutions to think about how they can play a real active role in supporting things like local purchasing, continuing ed, and others. Out of the pandemic, I think if you go to many of our downtowns, there's an opportunity to reimagine those, to think about how a once sort of 12-hour commercial district has a new life that really becomes an 18-hour community. We see a real integration in live, work. We're starting to repurpose commercial spaces. And so, the pandemic has created challenges in some of our urban cores and our suburban downtown areas. And in some of even our frankly, our rural towns, but have created a real opportunity to think about how we reuse that space and build that space to be more resilient and sustainable for the future. And then finally, I'd be amiss if as an urban guy if I didn't talk about equitable development and placemaking. We've got to think about how we think about placemaking. We have to think about our land use. Many of our communities, particularly for many of you that are here in Austin or other places, know that we're growing really, really fast. There used to be an affordability advantage in Texas, and much of that is gone by the wayside. And so we're going to have to really think about equitable development going forward. Some densification, some investment in different types of affordability initiatives. There was a recent Texas Lyceum poll that said that now, 7 in 10 Texans actually believe that the state of Texas, our legislature and others, have to help us help local communities address affordability issues. So now, as we're thinking about statewide elections, really bringing to the forefront of how we're thinking about building equitable places and cities and communities is going to be a real issue that we should hold our elected officials accountable for going forward, for sure. So with that, I think there is hope. Texas is very much as I've said before, I think it is the future of what America looks like. I think there's an opportunity to think about how we have done a lot of things in the past and build off of those successes. But there is an opportunity for us to think about how we can build more inclusive, more just, resilient Texas going forward. Because, I do think that as goes Texas, there's this sort of saying that as goes Texas, perhaps so goes the rest of the U.S. And I think there is an opportunity for us to not only build a better place here, but also think about what are lessons learned that we can submit and share with other communities across the country. So with that, I'm going to stop. If you're interested in sharing some ideas, my email here is at the end of below on my slide. It's pedigo@utexas.edu. I'm also on Twitter at I am Stephen Pedigo. I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts, and I very much look forward to the next 15 minutes or so, spending some time with you answering questions.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I'm going to jump right in with some of the questions for you, Stephen, if that's okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
And I know you try to steer away from the policy side and politics side as much as possible. So I'm going to kind of summarize a lot of some of the questions that came in that were very targeted in that area, with just this great question of, do you really think Texas leadership wants resiliency and equality? And if that's true, how do policymakers deal with leadership that seems not to want resiliency sometimes or equality sometimes to overcome some of these humps that you're talking about?
It's a really great question. So first of all, whoever's asking that question, one of the things I'd encourage you to do is to take a look at the piece that I wrote in the Times, because I think you get a real sense of how I sort of see the politics about this playing out. I do think that maybe some of our statewide leaders, we've created this interesting growth model, right, where Texas has been a place that has went all in on attracting, educated residents, different types of technology-based companies, folks from California, New York, and other places. It's become this kind of haven for this emerging, what my colleague would call creative class. And so what's interesting to me about that approach, and it's been an approach that's been really important, right, in terms of creating that diversification that's important to the growth of the state going forward. But interesting enough, it will over time, we could argue, possibly change the demographics and the politics of our state as well. And as someone that sort of follows policy and the politics of the state really recently, it's interesting to me that in the last 2 or 3 years, and again, this is Stephen Pedigo as a not as a professor, but just as an individual, as a voting Texan, perhaps. It's interesting to me to say that the politics of Texas is running really interestingly, not in an opposite direction, perhaps, about where maybe the future of the state is going in terms of the demographics of the state and how that could play out in terms of politics. And so, I do think that we see some cognitive dissonance, particularly at the state level right now, as it relates to a lot of the social issues that are happening and playing across the state in terms of the abortion bill, the challenge of transgender children, and the open carry law and others. And I wonder, like, is that signaling to my mentor Rich Florida wrote a lot about the idea of wanting to create an open, inclusive place, because that's what attracts a lot of different types of diverse talent, which fuels economic growth. And so, understanding that, I wonder if that sort of perspective and that growth around the way our politics has changed dramatically, frankly, over the last couple legislatures, is that going to stump the growth by which we're seeing across the state of Texas, and how that may help us think about being a more resilient state, a more resilient community going forward. So I worry about state politics. On the flip side of that, I do think that at the local level, there are a lot of business leaders, private sector, state, city, county elected officials that really are, I think, committed to this question of resiliency and question to city building, to be more reflective maybe of their local communities. And so one of the things that I think has been essential to the state of Texas is this question around this real local approach to governance. And I think that if you look what's happening in places like Dallas or Austin or Houston, or out in El Paso, or even Laredo and Brownsville, there is this real commitment of the public and private sector at the local level to try to figure out how they build more equitable communities, for sure, and commit to this resiliency piece. So I see some of this. I see that it's interesting for me that maybe while the statewide politics are moving in a direction that creates a bit of this cognitive dissonance, I wonder if at the local level we are doing some things right, that can in moving our policies in a way that maybe are reflective of the local communities. And again, right, as I said before, as an urbanist, I wouldn't want Houston to adopt all of the growth practices of the city of Austin. I wouldn't want the city of Austin to be like the Dallas-Fort Worth area. What's made our state this interesting model for urbanism is that we've had this really local approach to development going forward. And I think we want to get back to that, to ensuring that we can do some of these issues around resiliency. That said, it requires some state policies to support that. And so we can't be naive about that. But I also don't think it's all bad either. That's a long answer to your question, but I hope that answers the question.
No, I think that was great. And kind of a follow-up, although you kind of touched on it, I just want to make sure that that's clear, is what city or regions in Texas do you think are doing the best job of incorporating, those local ideas and planning for the future that you're describing, even if they are different, like you said, Houston versus Austin or smaller areas?
Yeah, every time I talk to mayors across the state of Texas, mayors and city council members and county executives and stuff, I think there's a lot of excitement that's happening. I think that, starting with what maybe Mayor Parker has done in Fort Worth around her initiatives to support women in childcare, that to me is a real opportunity as a model to think about economic development going forward. I think that's super exciting. And we know that's an issue that's going to be important going forward. I look at Houston. Places like, the issue of homelessness and the unhoused across this country is one of the most challenging urban issues that we face. And I live here in Austin, and we know that's an issue here in Austin. But one of the most amazing success stories about this work is what the Coalition for the Homeless have done in Houston and Harris County. And in fact, it's considered one of the best practices across the country. There was a great piece a few weeks ago in the Los Angeles Times saying that if cities like Los Angeles and New York and others and Austin want to understand how to tackle the issues of homelessness, look what's happening in Houston and Harris County. There's some great successes around that. I look at San Antonio as a place that has done really great work about aligning workforce training with industry needs. I look at El Paso as a place that, despite the efforts of the challenges that maybe that they're facing with the issues of the border as it relates to some of the policies that happening right now with the border crossings, they have done a really interesting job. Their civic and business and anchor leadership are trying to really truly build a binational sort of economy with Ciudad Juarez and how those two communities can leverage each other's. And so I think there's I say all of that to say, and not to be, Pollyannish, but to say there is a lot of great things happening in our state. But sometimes those great examples get lost in some of the noise as we kind of see the politics of the bickering on both sides on the statewide policy issues.
Absolutely. And kind of on that note as well, you sounded really excited. I believe you said Fort Worth is doing great things around childcare. There's a couple of questions just on women's reproductive health, but childcare specifically. How is Fort Worth doing in that, and what can we do? Suggestions to help our local communities do a better job of expanding and strengthening our childcare and support network, so that way more people can be doing these small business ventures or totally investing in more.
Well, y'all, I would say it's so important. So couple thoughts on that. I'm going to ramble for a bit because it's such an important question. So first of all, I think one of the most important things to and I think the line of questions that you're asking around this are important to illustrate this point, is that the pandemic really taught us that childcare is not a nice to have, it is a need to have, right? It is an essential infrastructure for economic development and community development in our communities. Without a doubt, right? We've always thought about infrastructure, bridges and roadways and logistics, our digital infrastructure, broadband and others as critical infrastructure pieces of our economy. I think what the pandemic showed us, right, is that childcare is an important human infrastructure, right? That for everyone to have to create a more equitable Texas, to have both greater participations from both men and women in the economy, residents of all walks of life, et cetera, we've got to have a better childcare sector in the state of Texas. So I think that's super important. And I'll say, perhaps the pandemic is the first time that this has actually been to the forefront of policy. My former colleague, Vicky DeSoto, who's now the dean of the Clinton School, wrote a wonderful policy paper on this. And I encourage you guys to do a quick Google and check out the policy paper. She provides a lot of recommendations about this. But I think a couple things to highlight, first of all, is that while on the supply side, we know there's not enough childcare, right? There's not enough childcare to meet the needs that we need, quality childcare. We also know that on the side of the folks that are working in those sectors, the small businesses that are there, the childcare workers, the system isn't working for them at all either. And so, unfortunately, states like Texas and other places, we have looked to the market to really be the driver for childcare. Most childcare in this country is privatized, in the state and across the country, frankly, is privatized. And so one of the things I think that we should be looking to our state policy leaders to do is to really support an initiative across the state that looks at how the state can better support childcare facilities, really taking on childcare as as part of a public good, creating new types of models, public-private partnerships, looking at how we can do different types of funding mechanisms and others. And so there's a real need at the state level to really support these efforts as well. And I think that, to me, is something that we should, as we go out to the polls in the next upcoming statewide elections, as we look at how the elections are going to play out in our cities for county executives and county judges and our mayors and our council members. This question of childcare is something that should be at the forefront of all of our discussions with those candidates to ask, what are their solutions? What solutions are they willing to put to the table to really ensure that we're doing this in a way that can really help support the growth going forward?
Excellent. Let me turn the knob a little bit here, and you talked a little bit about what President Hartzell has talked about with the University of Texas, but also you touched a little bit on community colleges. What do you see the role of community colleges in meeting the workforce pipeline and training programs that are needed in our state? And what will it take in terms of state policy and funding to make all of that happen? Easy question.
Yeah, that's a big question, right? That's a big question. Well, I mean, I think, so first of all, I think I think Texas is doing a lot of things right when it comes to workforce development. We've got some great we've got some great continuing education programs. I think that we've done a lot with our workforce boards and others, workforce organizations, to create programs that are starting to scale the next generation of Texans and current residents as well. But one could argue we got to do more of it. We've got to think about how we invest more resources in that, how we scale that. I think that's super important. One. Two, I think in addition to looking at our community colleges, if you look across not just community colleges across the state of Texas, but you look at places, so many of our our smaller regional colleges, throughout our UT system, but also places like SFA University and others, and Deep East Texas and others. A lot of those institutions are significantly underfunded and maybe need more funding to ensure that they're able to build out more robust pipelines connected to their local communities. And look, I'm not saying just to fund those institutions, but fund those institutions and hold them accountable for ensuring that they're building a pipeline of programs and training initiatives that are tied to the local economy. I think that's a second piece of this. Thirdly, I think that we're going to have to think about the use of technology. Our state is so diverse, so large. How do we deliver more and more of our educational services in a way that is as innovative as it was during the pandemic? We were teaching different types of modalities, different types of courses, using technology to extend those courses. So we're going to have to do much more around extending around the use of technology to scale those services and ensure those services are being supported. And then fourth, I think, is that if you really want to, if we really want to encourage Texans to upskill, we want to encourage the single mother, or single father, or person maybe who doesn't have a high school diploma to get skilled in those technology courses, in those workforce programs. We're going to have to ensure they have the wraparound services to do it. We're going to have to ensure that we've got the childcare, as what was mentioned earlier. We're going to have to ensure that we're doing things that are more flexible, that have the types of support safety nets around them. We know that one of the true predictors of success as it relates to skill development is mentorship and direct career paths. And so, that all requires resources and requires investing in a system that is really centered on current Texans. And so we're going to have to do more of that, I think, as to really sort of meet the goal and demand of what this workforce looks like going forward. I think the most interesting thing about the other last point I would say about this is that even across the country, there is a lot of us have 4-year college degrees. A lot of the folks on this call are Texas graduates, but many of our residents across the state of Texas don't have 4-year degrees, and so maybe they've got 2-year technical degrees. Maybe they've got some sophisticated training. And so, one of the things that we're going to also have to do is reshape the expectations of what training looks like on the private side as well. How do we get private sector companies and employers more engaged in our workforce development program? And also just thinking about, raising questions. So, for instance, does a programming technology degree really require a 4-year formal education, or can it be an on-the-job type of training initiative, or an apprenticeship program, or a 2-year technical degree? Thinking more about what the hierarchy of how degrees and skill training relates to the workforce is also something else that the state's going to have to take on as it relates to really ensuring that we're matching the skills of our residents up with what the demand of the economy looks like going forward as well.
Excellent. We just have one more time for one more comment really in question here, and I'm summarizing a couple of different questions. Taxes is the only way we can really fund all of this new programming. Do we need to change the way we do taxes here in Texas, income taxes versus the very high property taxes?
Yeah,
I know that's a really big question, but is that the only way we can really look at changing so much of our infrastructure here?
Well, I mean, I think so that's a big question, and I'm not an expert in tax policy by any means, or folks who know more about that. I think there's a need to explore, maybe not necessarily an income tax, but maybe there's a need to explore how we're allocating resources across the state. Thinking about how we are looking at new revenue models, right? I mean, one of the things that the state has a real strong history of is the use of public-private partnerships as it relates to infrastructure development. Is there the need to think about more interesting partnerships, engaging with the private sector, the use of the market to accomplish some of these issues? I'll give you an example. A lot of us sort of think about affordable housing as as urbanists. A lot of us have to think about affordable housing, for instance, as being something that's really connected to the public domain, a public good. The answer to that actually is that, in fact, if the state of Texas wanted to build more affordable housing, it could incentivize, not require, but incentivize the private sector to do that in a way that creates a return on investment for both the private sector as well as for the community. And so, rather than just thinking about tax policy as a way to do this, one of the things that I think we should do as a state is get back to the ethos of who we are, and that is that it's not a top-down approach. It's not a one-size-fits-all model, that it is the idea of cross-sector collaboration. It's the idea that the public and private are together. And if we can get the public and private sector to create that shared value, we can start to address some of these big city building challenges that we face to ensure that we are able to, sitting here 10, 15 years from now, say that Texas still is kind of the future of where America is. And it is going to be the place of opportunity, but it's going to require, I think, not just tax policy, but this cross-sector collaboration that is in the ethos of who we are as a state. And I just think we've gotten away from it a bit. We got to get back to it a bit as well. So I hope that helps. It's been great spending time with y'all.
I love that ending. I love that comment, and I love that you're a born-again Texan and back here, and we're utilizing all of your knowledge here at the University of Texas. So thank you so much, Professor Pedigo, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We appreciate all the time that you're spent here with our Texas X's, and thank you to everyone that has participated in this month's event that's tuning in right now or tuning in later, and we hope to see you all again in May at our next lunchtime lecture. It will be hosted virtually on Tuesday, May 17th with Dr. Lauren Ehrlich, an immunologist at the Dell Medical School. And you can learn more and register online at www.texasx's.org/lunchtime lectures. Thanks again for joining us today, and have a wonderful week. Hook 'em horns.